Hi, I'm Lily Hartford. I was threading a needle to repair a damaged puppet when my phone exploded with notifications. Screenshot after screenshot of Facebook posts calling me a predator, a danger to children, a groomer who used innocent puppets to lure kids. My own parents had posted the most vicious one. Our daughter has lost her way. We cannot support what she's doing to vulnerable children. Then my elderly neighbor Eugene knocked on my workshop door and whispered, "Pack the evidence, dear. It's time they learned who really owns half this town." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Ever wondered what happens when the people who raised you become your worst enemies, only to discover they've been living off money that was always meant for you? The autumn rain drummed against the converted garage windows as I sat surrounded by dozens of colorful puppets, each one carefully crafted for children with special needs. My fingers moved automatically through the familiar motions of repairing a torn seam on a therapy puppet designed for kids with autism. The soft blue fabric had been damaged during yesterday's session at the community center, where 8-year-old Marcus had finally spoken his first full sentence while playing with Mr. Giggles the elephant. That moment should have been pure joy. Instead, it felt tainted by the whispers that had started circulating around Maplewood 3 weeks ago. Parents pulling their children away when they saw me at the grocery store. Hushed conversations that stopped abruptly when I entered Bean There coffee shop. The slow, creeping realization that something was happening behind my back. Something that threatened everything I'd built with Little Dreams Workshop. I'd moved to this quiet Vermont town 2 years earlier, fleeing a corporate marketing job that had left me hollow and exhausted. The idea for therapeutic puppets had come during a volunteer stint at a children's hospital, watching how a simple sock puppet could transform a frightened child's entire demeanor. Within months, I'd rented the small garage behind Mrs. Pemberton's house on Elm Street, filled it with fabric, thread, and hope, and begun creating specialized puppets for children dealing with trauma, developmental delays, and communication challenges. The work wasn't lucrative, but it filled something inside me that 6 years of selling luxury cars to wealthy executives never had. Each puppet was designed with specific therapeutic goals in mind. Weighted bodies for sensory regulation, pockets for worry stones, removable parts for children learning about boundaries. The parents who brought their kids to my workshop spoke about breakthroughs, about their children finally expressing emotions they'd kept locked away. My own parents, Robert and Patricia Hartford, had never understood the transition. They'd spent considerable money on my business degree, expecting me to climb corporate ladders and accumulate traditional markers of success. When I announced I was leaving my 6-figure salary to make puppets in a garage, their disappointment had been palpable. Still, they'd maintained a polite distance, occasionally asking about my little hobby during our monthly phone calls. That distance had shifted into something colder over the past year. My mother had started making pointed comments about my unmarried status, my unconventional career, my choice to work with damaged children instead of pursuing normal relationships. My father had grown increasingly critical, questioning my financial decisions, suggesting I was wasting my education, implying that I was avoiding real adult responsibilities. The rain intensified as I finished the repair work on Mr. Giggles. Through the workshop windows, I could see the lights glowing warmly in Eugene Whitman's Victorian house across the street. The elderly man had been my most consistent supporter since I'd arrived in Maplewood. He'd helped me move my sewing machines into the garage, brought me homemade soup during my first brutal Vermont winter, and often sat in his front garden, waving at the children who came for puppet therapy sessions. Eugene was something of a local legend. At 87, he'd lived in the grand house on Maple Avenue his entire life, though nobody seemed to know much about his past beyond vague references to military service and some kind of business success decades earlier. He kept to himself mostly, tending his elaborate gardens and reading thick books on his wraparound porch. The townspeople respected him but maintained a comfortable distance, the way small communities often treat their elderly eccentrics. My phone buzzed with a text message, and I glanced at it absently while organizing my thread collection. The message was from Janet Morrison, whose 7-year-old daughter Sophie had been coming to puppet therapy for 6 months to work through anxiety following her parents' divorce. The text was short and cold. "We won't be needing your services anymore. Please don't contact us again." A knot formed in my stomach. Sophie had been making remarkable progress, her selective mutism gradually giving way to whispered conversations with her favorite puppet, a gentle bear named Dr. Cuddles. Just last week, she'd used the puppet to express her feelings about the divorce, a breakthrough that had brought tears to Janet's eyes. The sudden termination made no sense. I scrolled through my phone, checking for other messages. 3 more cancellations had arrived within the past hour. Parents who had praised my work just days earlier were now cutting all ties without explanation. The professional language couldn't hide an undertone of disgust, as though I'd committed some unforgivable transgression. My hands began to shake as I set the phone aside and tried to focus on organizing puppet supplies. The workshop felt smaller suddenly, the cheerful colors of my creations seeming to mock the growing dread in my chest. Something was happening, something that threatened to destroy everything I'd worked to build. The sound of my phone buzzing again made me jump. This time it was a Facebook notification, then another. Then a rapid-fire succession of alerts that made the device vibrate against the workbench like an angry wasp. With trembling fingers, I opened the app and watched my world explode. The first post was from a parent named Derek Chambers, whose son had attended exactly 2 puppet workshops before Derek decided the activities were too weird and pulled him out. The post was long, rambling, and filled with thinly veiled accusations about inappropriate relationships between adults and children. He mentioned, quote, concerning behavior and red flags without providing any specific details, but the implication was unmistakable. The comments section had erupted. Parents who had never met me were sharing their own suspicions and concerns. Someone had posted a link to an article about convicted predators who had used crafts and activities to gain access to children. Another person shared statistics about abuse in after-school programs. The conversation had taken on the breathless, fevered quality of a witch hunt, with each participant trying to demonstrate their vigilance in protecting innocent children. But it was the next post that made my blood freeze. My own mother, Patricia Hartford, had shared Derek's original post with her own commentary. This breaks my heart, but I have to speak up. This is my daughter, and while we love her, we cannot support what she's doing. We've tried to talk to her about these concerning activities, but she refuses to listen. As parents, we have a responsibility to protect all children, even when it means confronting painful truths about our own family. The post had dozens of shares and hundreds of comments. People I'd never met were discussing my character, my motivations, my fitness to be around children. Some were calling for police investigations. Others were demanding that I be banned from all local schools and community centers. The mob mentality was building momentum with each passing hour. My father had added his own post an hour later, more measured in tone but equally devastating in impact. He discussed his disappointment in my career choices, my stubborn refusal to pursue traditional relationships, my, quote, concerning fixation on damaged and vulnerable children. He positioned himself as a reluctant whistleblower, a concerned parent forced to choose between family loyalty and child safety. The post ended with a plea for other parents to trust their instincts and protect their children from potential predators, even when those predators wore friendly faces and offered seemingly innocent activities. I scrolled through comment after comment, watching my reputation disintegrate in real time. Parents were sharing screenshots of my workshop advertisements, analyzing the language for hidden meanings. Someone had posted photos of my garage workspace, taken secretly during pickup times, pointing out that I worked alone with children in an isolated location. Others questioned why an unmarried woman in her 30s would choose to work with kids instead of having her own family. The most painful comments came from parents whose children I'd genuinely helped. They were publicly second-guessing their decision to trust me, wondering if their children's progress had come at some terrible hidden cost. Janet Morrison had commented on my mother's post. I thought Sophie's improvements were real, but now I'm wondering what really happened during those private sessions. Thank God we stopped coming when we did. Through the workshop windows, I could see lights turning on in houses throughout the neighborhood. People were home from work, checking their phones, catching up on the day's social media drama. By tomorrow morning, everyone in Maplewood would know my name and believe the worst possible things about me. I closed Facebook and immediately opened my business email, hoping for some refuge from the social media storm. Instead, I found 17 cancellation messages from parents, 3 angry demands for refunds from workshops that hadn't even occurred yet, and a formal letter from the Maplewood Community Center informing me that my contract to run weekly puppet therapy sessions had been immediately terminated due to, quote, community safety concerns. The community center letter was particularly brutal. It referenced credible reports about inappropriate behavior and stated that my access to all municipal facilities had been revoked pending a full investigation. The letter was signed by Sandra Chen, the community center director who had enthusiastically recruited me just 8 months earlier after seeing the positive impact my work had on local children. My phone rang, and I saw Eugene Whitman's name on the caller ID. His voice was gentle but urgent when I answered. Lily, dear, I think you should come over to the house. Bring whatever documentation you have about your business, your qualifications, anything official. We need to talk. I gathered up my business licenses, insurance paperwork, and the folder containing testimonials from parents whose children had benefited from puppet therapy. The rain had softened to a steady drizzle as I crossed the street to Eugene's house, my sneakers splashing through puddles that reflected the streetlights like scattered coins. Eugene met me at his front door, his usually cheerful demeanor replaced by grim determination.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
He was a small man, barely 5.5 feet tall, with white hair that stuck up in wispy tufts and deep blue eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Despite his age, he moved with surprising energy as he ushered me into his living room. The interior of the Whitman house was like stepping back in time. Dark wood paneling, built-in bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes, heavy furniture that spoke of craftsmanship from an earlier era. But what caught my attention were the framed photographs covering every available surface. Pictures of children playing with toys, awards ceremonies, groups of adults in business attire from what appeared to be several decades past. Eugene gestured for me to sit in a wingback chair while he settled across from me with my folder of documentation. His expression was serious as he flipped through the papers, occasionally nodding or making small sounds of approval. Finally, he looked up at me with eyes that seemed to hold depths I'd never noticed before. Lily, he said quietly, what I'm about to tell you is going to sound impossible, but I need you to listen carefully. Your parents have been living off money that was never theirs. Money that was supposed to support exactly the kind of work you've been doing with these children. I stared at him, not understanding. What are you talking about? Eugene stood and walked to a massive oak desk in the corner of the room. He pressed something along the edge of a drawer, and I heard a soft click. A hidden compartment slid open, revealing stacks of legal documents and old photographs. He pulled out a thick manila folder and returned to his chair. 40 years ago, he began, I founded Whitman Educational Enterprises. We manufactured educational toys, therapeutic materials for children with special needs, training resources for teachers and therapists. The company was quite successful, and when I retired, I established a foundation to continue supporting innovative work in child development and therapy. He opened the folder and showed me documents bearing official seals and signatures. Corporate papers, foundation bylaws, financial statements from decades past. The numbers were staggering, representing millions of dollars in assets and ongoing revenue. The foundation was designed to identify and support individuals doing meaningful work with children, particularly those using creative and therapeutic approaches. We've been quietly funding programs across the country for decades, always looking for the next generation of innovators who could carry on the mission. I shook my head, still confused about what this had to do with me or my parents. Eugene seemed to read my thoughts and leaned forward in his chair. 2 years ago, when you first moved to Maplewood, I began documenting your work. The therapeutic puppets, the specialized techniques you developed, the remarkable results you were achieving with children who hadn't responded to traditional therapy. Everything you were doing aligned perfectly with the Foundation's mission. He pulled out another set of documents, these ones more recent. 6 months ago, I officially designated you as the primary beneficiary of the Whitman Educational Foundation. Not just funding for your work, but eventual ownership of the entire enterprise when I'm gone. The paperwork was filed with my attorneys, notarized, completely legal and binding. My mind reeled as I tried to process what he was telling me. But what does this have to do with my parents? Eugene's expression darkened. Your parents have been receiving quarterly payments from a subsidiary trust fund for the past 18 months. Payments that were supposed to go directly to you to support your workshop, but which I mistakenly sent to them based on outdated contact information from when you lived at home. They've been cashing checks meant to fund your puppet therapy work and using the money for their own purposes. The room seemed to tilt around me. How much money? $47,000 so far. Money that should have gone toward expanding your workshop, purchasing specialized materials, maybe even opening a proper therapy center. I thought about my parents, recent home renovations, my father's new car, my mother's expensive vacation to Europe. Money they'd claimed came from my father's promotion and careful budgeting. Money that had actually been stolen from my work with vulnerable children. But why would they sabotage me now? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Eugene's smile was grim. Because 3 days ago, my attorney called your parents' house trying to reach you about signing the final beneficiary paperwork. The paperwork that would transfer full ownership of a multi-million-dollar educational toy company directly to you. I suspect they realized their gravy train was about to end, and that you were about to become wealthy enough to expose what they'd been doing. He handed me a letter bearing the official letterhead of Whitman Educational Enterprises. My name was printed clearly as the designated heir to an empire built on exactly the kind of work I'd been doing in my small garage workshop. They tried to destroy your reputation before you could claim what's rightfully yours, Eugene said softly. But what they don't realize is that we've been documenting everything. Every session with the children. Every parent testimonial. Every breakthrough and success story. We have evidence that proves beyond any doubt that you're exactly the kind of person this foundation was created to support. I stared at the documents in my hands, at the proof that my life's work had value beyond anything I'd imagined. Outside, the rain had stopped, and moonlight streamed through the tall windows of Eugene's living room. My phone continued buzzing with notifications from the social media storm my parents had created, but suddenly those seemed like distant thunder from a passing storm. What happens now? I asked. Eugene's eyes gleamed with something that might have been anticipation. Now, my dear, we show them what happens when people try to destroy someone who has more power than they ever imagined. I spent the night on Eugene's couch, unable to return to my garage workshop, knowing that neighbors might be watching, photographing, documenting every movement for the growing online mob. Sleep came in fragments between the constant buzzing of my phone and the weight of documents spread across the coffee table like evidence at a crime scene. Eugene had disappeared into his study around midnight, muttering about phone calls to make and files to retrieve. When dawn broke gray and cold through the tall windows, I found him already dressed and moving through the kitchen with surprising energy, brewing coffee in an ancient percolator that filled the house with rich, bitter aromas. The morning news played softly on a small television tucked between cookbooks on the counter. Local headlines scrolled past about town council meetings and school fundraisers, the ordinary concerns of a community that had no idea how dramatically their understanding of one resident was about to shift. Eugene muted the volume as he poured coffee into delicate china cups that looked older than I was. Victoria Kane will be here at 9, he said, settling across from me at a kitchen table worn smooth by decades of use. She's been the foundation's attorney for 23 years, sharp as broken glass and twice as cutting when she needs to be. You'll like her. I wrapped my hands around the warm cup, letting the heat seep into fingers that felt permanently cold since reading those Facebook posts. What exactly are we planning to do? Even if I can prove the money was meant for me, that doesn't undo what people believe about my character. Eugene's smile was thin and calculating. My dear girl, you're thinking too small. This isn't about recovering stolen funds or clearing your name. This is about demonstrating the difference between people who build things and people who destroy them. Your parents have spent months positioning themselves as protectors of children, while pocketing money meant to help those same children. The irony is almost poetic. He disappeared upstairs and returned carrying a wooden box inlaid with mother-of-pearl patterns. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, lay dozens of photographs spanning what appeared to be several decades. Children playing with educational toys, therapy sessions in progress, award ceremonies where Eugene stood beside prominent figures I vaguely recognized from business magazines. Whitman Educational Enterprises didn't just manufacture toys, Eugene explained, sorting through the images. We pioneered therapeutic approaches for children with developmental disabilities, autism spectrum disorders, trauma recovery. The foundation has supported research that changed how we understand childhood development. You've been doing instinctively what it took our research teams years to prove scientifically. One photograph showed a young Eugene, perhaps 40 years old, demonstrating a complex puppet theater system to a group of children in leg braces and wheelchairs. The joy on their faces was unmistakable, the same expression I'd seen countless times in my own workshop when a breakthrough moment arrived unexpectedly. The puppet theater you see there became the prototype for therapeutic play systems now used in children's hospitals worldwide, Eugene continued. The weighted dolls you create for sensory regulation? We patented the concept in 1987 based on research funded through the foundation. Your removable puppet parts for teaching boundaries? That's an evolution of techniques we developed for working with trauma survivors. My coffee grew cold as I stared at image after image of work that paralleled my own. Specialized toys designed for specific therapeutic goals. Play therapy sessions that looked remarkably similar to my puppet workshops. Children with challenges finding their voices through creative expression and carefully designed interactions. You're telling me I've been reinventing things that already existed? No, Eugene said firmly. You've been innovating, advancing, improving on concepts we established decades ago. The foundation exists specifically to identify people like you, individuals who push the field forward through intuition and dedication rather than formal research protocols. What you've accomplished in a garage workshop would take most graduate programs years to develop. The doorbell chimed precisely at 9 o'clock. Eugene moved to answer it with the punctuality of someone accustomed to important appointments. The woman who entered his living room commanded attention despite her modest height. Victoria Kane appeared to be in her mid-50s, with steel gray hair pulled into a severe bun and eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of her surroundings within seconds. She wore a charcoal business suit that probably cost more than I'd made in the past 3 months, but her manner was direct rather than pretentious. After brief introductions, she spread her own collection of documents across Eugene's dining room table with the efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. I've reviewed the foundation bylaws, the trust agreements, and the beneficiary designations. She began without preamble. Everything Eugene has told you is accurate and legally binding. You are now the primary heir to Whitman Educational Enterprises, which includes manufacturing facilities, research partnerships with major universities, and ongoing contracts with therapeutic institutions across North America. She handed me a leather portfolio containing documents that made my head spin. Corporate structures, patent holdings, licensing agreements with companies whose names I recognized from toy store shelves. The scope was overwhelming, representing decades of work and millions of dollars in assets. The quarterly payments your parents have been receiving were indeed intended for you, Victoria continued. However, the error in distribution creates an interesting legal situation. They've been converting funds through misrepresentation, which constitutes fraud under Vermont law. More significantly, they've used those funds while simultaneously working to damage your reputation and destroy your business. She opened a laptop and turned the screen toward me. Social media posts, timestamps, a digital timeline tracking the acceleration of attacks on my character. The pattern was clear and methodical, building from subtle character assassination to outright accusations of criminal behavior. They began questioning your career choices publicly, approximately 6 weeks after the first incorrectly delivered payment, Victoria noted. The timing suggests they realized the money was meant for you and decided to discredit you before you could discover the error. What they didn't anticipate was that Eugene had already begun the formal process of transferring full ownership to you. Eugene leaned forward in his chair. Show her the surveillance footage. Victoria opened another file on her laptop. Grainy security camera footage showed my parents' driveway, time-stamped 3 days earlier. A car I didn't recognize pulled up, and a man in a business suit approached their front door. The angle made it impossible to see faces clearly, but the body language suggested an official visit, perhaps someone delivering legal documents or conducting formal business. "That's my process server," Victoria explained. "He was delivering the final beneficiary paperwork for your signature." Your mother answered the door, accepted the documents, and seemed quite interested in their contents. The footage shows her bringing them inside, and then approximately 30 minutes later, making phone calls from her front porch. She advanced the timeline to show my mother pacing in her front yard while talking animatedly on her phone. The conversation lasted nearly 20 minutes, with frequent gestures and obvious agitation. Even without audio, it was clear she was sharing urgent information with someone who found it equally disturbing. The first Facebook post questioning your character appeared less than 4 hours after this conversation, Victoria said. The escalation to direct accusations of inappropriate behavior with children began the following morning. The timing strongly suggests a coordinated response to learning about your inheritance. I stared at the screen, watching my own mother orchestrate the destruction of my reputation with the calculated precision of someone who had everything to lose. The woman who had taught me to tie my shoes and helped me with homework was systematically dismantling my life to protect money she had no legal right to claim. "What's our next step?" I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. Victoria closed the laptop and began organizing documents into neat stacks. "We document everything. Every false accusation, every canceled contract, every piece of damage they've caused to your business and reputation. Then we demonstrate the difference between their claims about protecting children and your actual work with those same children." Eugene stood and walked to a bookshelf lined with photo albums. He pulled out several volumes and set them on the table beside Victoria's legal documents. The albums contained hundreds of pictures from my puppet workshops over the past 2 years, carefully dated and annotated with details about each child's progress and breakthrough moments. "I've been documenting your work since you arrived," Eugene admitted. "Not for legal reasons initially, but because what you were accomplishing deserved to be recorded. The Foundation has always maintained detailed records of the programs we support. Your parents have accused you of inappropriate behavior with vulnerable children, but these photographs tell a different story." The first album opened to show Marcus, the 8-year-old with autism who had spoken his first full sentence while playing with Mr. Giggles. The sequence of photos captured his journey from initial reluctance to full engagement, his growing comfort with social interaction through puppet-mediated communication. Notes in Eugene's careful handwriting documented his progress over months of sessions. Page after page revealed similar stories. Sophie working through divorce anxiety with Dr. Cuddles the bear. Tommy using aggressive puppet play to process his anger about his father's deployment overseas. Emma finding her voice after selective mutism through elaborate puppet theater performances. Each child's journey was meticulously documented, showing not just improvement, but transformation through carefully structured, therapeutic play. "Your parents have accused you of exploiting vulnerable children," Victoria said, reviewing the albums. "But these records demonstrate the exact opposite. You've developed innovative therapeutic techniques that help children process trauma, develop communication skills, and build emotional resilience. This isn't exploitation. It's exactly the kind of work the Whitman Foundation was created to support and expand." Eugene pointed to specific photographs that showed parents crying with relief as their children reached developmental milestones they'd been told might never come. Testimonial letters praising my patience and skill. Thank you cards drawn by small hands and signed with shaky letters expressing gratitude for help they couldn't fully articulate. "We have 2 years of documented evidence proving that your work produces measurable positive outcomes for children who struggle with traditional therapeutic approaches," Eugene said. "Meanwhile, your parents have been converting money meant to fund this work while simultaneously trying to destroy it through character assassination." Victoria made notes on a legal pad, her pen moving quickly as she outlined what appeared to be a comprehensive strategy. "We'll need sworn statements from parents who can attest to the positive impact of your work. We'll need documentation of every financial harm caused by their false accusations. And we'll need to trace every dollar they received that should have gone to supporting your workshop." The weight of what we were planning began to settle on my shoulders. This wasn't just about clearing my name or recovering stolen money. We were preparing to expose my own parents as people who had systematically undermined work designed to help vulnerable children, while profiting from funds meant to support that same work. Eugene seemed to read my thoughts. I know this feels overwhelming, dear, but consider what they've done not just to you, but to every child who could have benefited from better funded programs, expanded services, additional therapeutic resources. They didn't just steal from you, they stole from Sophie and Marcus and every other child who needed what you could have provided with proper support. Victoria agreed. The foundation exists specifically to prevent situations like this. When people exploit systems designed to help vulnerable populations, we don't just recover the funds, we ensure it can't happen again. Your parents have demonstrated that they're exactly the kind of people these protections were designed to stop. Through the dining room windows, I could see neighbors beginning their morning routines. Dog walkers, joggers, parents loading children into cars for school drop-offs. The ordinary rhythms of community life continuing while 3 people sat in a Victorian house planning to upend everything those neighbors thought they understood about the woman across the street. My phone buzzed with another notification. More comments on the Facebook posts, more speculation about my motives and character. Someone had posted the address of my workshop, encouraging people to drive by and see for themselves how isolated and concerning the location appeared. The mob was growing bolder, more confident in their collective judgment. But sitting at Eugene's dining room table, surrounded by evidence of my actual work and legal documents proving my legitimate claim to resources I'd never imagined, the online attacks felt different. Less like a verdict and more like noise from people who had no idea what they were really discussing. Victoria packed her documents into a briefcase that looked expensive enough to fund several puppet workshops. I'll need you to compile a complete list of every cancellation, every lost contract, every piece of financial damage you can document. I'll also need access to your business records, insurance information, and any correspondence with parents about their children's progress. Eugene walked us to the front door, but before Victoria left, she turned back with an expression I couldn't quite read. There's one more thing you should know, Lily. The Whitman Foundation has been quietly supporting therapeutic programs for decades, but we've always operated behind the scenes. This situation with your parents has created an opportunity to demonstrate publicly why this work matters and what happens when people try to exploit it for personal gain. She glanced at Eugene, who nodded slowly. We're not just going to clear your name and recover the money. We're going to make this a case study in how communities can better support innovative therapeutic work and protect it from people who would rather profit from children's vulnerabilities than help address them. The implications of her words settled over me as Victoria's car disappeared down Maple Avenue. This wasn't going to be a quiet legal resolution. We were preparing to make my parents' betrayal a very public example of everything the foundation stood against. Eugene guided me back to his study, where morning light streamed through tall windows onto walls lined with certificates, awards, and photographs spanning decades of work in child development and therapeutic innovation. He pulled out a chair at his massive desk and gestured for me to sit while he retrieved another hidden folder from a locked drawer. Before we go any further, he said, settling across from me, you need to understand exactly what you'll be inheriting and why your parents' actions are even more significant than they realize. The folder contained financial statements and corporate reports that made my eyes widen. Whitman Educational Enterprises wasn't just successful. It was a dominant force in therapeutic toy manufacturing and educational resource development. Annual revenues in the tens of millions, partnerships with major healthcare systems, licensing agreements that generated ongoing royalties from innovations developed decades earlier. The foundation owns 43% of the company, Eugene explained. When I transfer ownership to you, you'll control not just the foundation's charitable work, but a significant stake in a profitable enterprise that employs over 2,000 people across North America. He showed me organizational charts that mapped out manufacturing facilities, research partnerships with universities, distribution networks that reached therapeutic institutions worldwide. The scope was staggering, representing generations of work in developing and refining approaches to helping children with special needs. Your puppet therapy techniques aren't just innovative, Eugene continued. They're marketable innovations that could be scaled up and distributed to therapeutic programs everywhere. The weighted puppets, the removable parts system, the specific protocols you've developed for different types of childhood trauma, these represent millions of dollars in potential patent value and licensing revenue. The responsibility of it all began to sink in. I had stumbled into techniques that could help thousands of children, backed by an organization with the resources and expertise to make that expansion possible. Meanwhile, my parents had been undermining that potential while pocketing money meant to develop it further. Eugene pulled out one final document, a thick report bound in navy blue covers. This is an independent assessment of your work, commissioned by the Foundation 6 months ago. Child development specialists, educational researchers, therapeutic professionals, they all reviewed your techniques and outcomes data. The report's conclusions were remarkable. My puppet therapy protocols showed significantly better results than traditional play therapy for children with autism spectrum disorders. The boundary teaching techniques I developed for trauma survivors exceeded standard therapeutic approaches in both speed and durability of improvement. My sensory regulation strategies were being recommended for adoption by several children's hospitals. "You've created something genuinely transformative," Eugene said quietly. "The Foundation exists to identify and support exactly this kind of innovation. Your parents haven't just stolen money, they've attacked work that could revolutionize how we help vulnerable children." I closed the report and looked around Eugene's study at the lifetime of achievements surrounding us. Awards for contributions to child development research, photographs with Nobel Prize winners, and internationally recognized experts in education and therapy. Patents framed like diplomas, representing innovations that had improved countless lives. "Why me?" I asked finally. "With all this success and expertise, why would you choose someone working out of a garage to inherit everything you've built?" Eugene's smile was gentle but firm. "Because you didn't choose this work for recognition or profit. You left a successful career to help children who needed what you could provide. You developed innovative techniques through intuition and dedication, rather than seeking grant funding or academic credentials. You represent exactly the kind of authentic commitment to helping others that this foundation was created to support." He gestured toward the window, where we could see children walking to school past my workshop garage. "Those techniques you developed? They came from your genuine desire to help specific children overcome specific challenges. That's not something you can teach in graduate school or replicate through corporate research. It's the kind of innovation that only emerges from people who truly care about the outcomes rather than the accolades." The morning was wearing on, and I knew Victoria would be expecting documentation of the damage my parents had caused. But sitting in Eugene's study, surrounded by evidence of what my work could become with proper support, I began to understand that we were fighting for something much larger than clearing my reputation or recovering stolen funds. We were defending the principle that therapeutic work with vulnerable children should be supported and protected, not exploited by people looking for easy money. We were demonstrating that innovation in helping others deserves to be recognized and expanded rather than attacked by those who couldn't understand its value. Most importantly, we were proving that sometimes the people who seem to have the least power actually hold the keys to transforming everything. The next 3 days transformed Eugene's Victorian house into a command center for what Victoria called comprehensive evidence compilation. She arrived each morning at 8 sharp, with fresh legal pads, a thermos of black coffee, and the determined efficiency of someone who had spent decades building airtight cases against people who underestimated her capabilities. My laptop occupied one end of the dining room table, surrounded by printed emails, canceled contracts, and screenshots of social media posts that grew more vicious with each passing hour. Victoria's briefcase disgorged folders containing financial records, trust documents, and correspondence that painted a detailed picture of my parents' systematic theft over 18 months of misdirected payments. Eugene moved between his study and the kitchen, emerging periodically with additional documentation that seemed to materialize from secret compartments throughout his house. Bank records showing exact dates when payments intended for my workshop had been deposited into my parents' personal accounts. photographs of home improvements and luxury purchases that coincided suspiciously with those deposits. Phone records proving conversations between my mother and the first parents who had posted accusations about my character. The scope of their deception became clear as we assembled a timeline that stretched back far longer than I had realized. The foundation's quarterly payments had been intended to reach me since I first opened Little Dream's workshop, but administrative errors had directed them to my parents' address where I had lived briefly after college. Instead of forwarding the payments or notifying anyone about the mistake, they had simply begun depositing checks made out to programs they knew nothing about. Victoria discovered that my father had actually called the foundation's administrative office 6 months after the first payment arrived, claiming to be my business manager and requesting that future payments be sent directly to him for more efficient processing. The foundation's bookkeeper, overwhelmed with dozens of similar arrangements for other beneficiaries, had updated their records without requiring additional verification. They didn't just passively receive money they weren't entitled to, Victoria explained, reviewing the phone logs. They actively worked to ensure the payments would continue coming to them rather than to you. That transforms this from a simple case of mistaken identity into deliberate fraud with intent to deprive you of funds legally designated for your therapeutic work. The financial analysis revealed the true scope of their theft. Beyond the $47,000 in direct payments, my parents had used foundation money to secure loans for home renovations, leveraging the regular payments as proof of stable income. They had purchased a new car, funded my mother's expensive hobbies, and even paid for a cruise to the Mediterranean that they had publicly described as a reward for my father's business success. Meanwhile, I had been struggling to purchase basic supplies for my workshop, rationing fabric and thread, declining opportunities to expand my programs because I couldn't afford additional materials or space. Children who could have benefited from more intensive puppet therapy sessions had received limited services because I lacked the resources to provide more comprehensive support. Eugene maintained detailed records of every session I had conducted, but as we compiled evidence of positive outcomes, we also documented missed opportunities. Marcus, the boy with autism who had achieved his breakthrough moment, could have progressed much faster with access to specialized sensory puppets I couldn't afford to create. Sophie's anxiety recovery might have been accelerated if I'd been able to offer daily sessions, rather than weekly ones. Emma's selective mutism treatment could have included family therapy components if funding had been available for additional training and materials. Your parents didn't just steal money, Eugene said grimly, reviewing notes about children whose progress had been limited by resource constraints. They stole therapeutic opportunities for vulnerable kids who needed what you could have provided with proper support. Victoria was building what she called a, quote, comprehensive harm assessment that went far beyond simple financial calculations. She documented the professional damage caused by my parents' character assassination campaign, including lost contracts, canceled workshops, and the complete destruction of my business reputation within the local community. The Maplewood Community Center cancellation alone represented $12,000 in annual income, but the ripple effects extended to parents who had been planning to enroll their children in future sessions. The social media campaign had achieved exactly what my parents intended. Local parents now viewed me with suspicion and fear, rather than as someone who provided valuable therapeutic services for their children. The puppet therapy techniques that had shown remarkable results were now dismissed as potentially dangerous activities that responsible parents should avoid. But as we documented the damage, we also uncovered evidence that my parents had been more calculating than I had initially realized. Victoria discovered that they had researched my business model, contacted other puppet therapists in neighboring towns, and even attended workshops on child development therapy to better understand the work they were systematically undermining. Phone records showed that my mother had made dozens of calls to parents of children in my programs, not just in the days following the beneficiary paperwork delivery, but stretching back over several months. She had been gradually planting seeds of doubt about my methods, my qualifications, and my motivations, long before the final social media assault. This wasn't a panicked reaction to learning about your inheritance, Victoria realized, studying the communication patterns. This was a deliberate, long-term strategy to discredit your work and drive away your clients. They knew that if your business failed, fewer people would question why you weren't receiving foundation support. Eugene found additional evidence in his own files. My parents had actually contacted the Whitman Foundation directly 8 months earlier, claiming to be concerned family members who had serious questions about my qualifications and methods. They had suggested that the foundation might want to reconsider supporting someone who worked with vulnerable children without proper oversight or credentials. The foundation's response had been to increase their monitoring and documentation of my work, which had only served to demonstrate how effective my techniques actually were. But my parents' inquiry had been noted in my file, creating a paper trail that showed their awareness of the foundation's support long before they claimed to have learned about it from the beneficiary paperwork. They knew about your connection to Whitman Educational Enterprises months before you did, Victoria concluded. The character assassination campaign wasn't damage control. It was preemptive sabotage designed to prevent you from ever discovering what you were entitled to claim. The most damaging evidence came from digital forensics that Victoria had commissioned through a firm she regularly used for complex cases. Analysis of my parents' internet searches revealed a disturbing pattern of research into legal challenges related to foundation beneficiaries, strategies for discrediting therapeutic professionals, and methods for reporting suspected child abuse that would trigger investigations without requiring specific evidence. They had researched how to file complaints with state licensing boards, how to contact Child Protective Services, and how to organize community campaigns against individuals working with children. The search history painted a picture of people who had spent considerable time planning exactly how to destroy my reputation and career. Victoria printed out screenshots of particularly damning searches, including queries about removing unfit beneficiaries from charitable trusts and, quote, legal challenges to foundation disbursements. My father had researched whether foundation assets could be redirected to family members if the original beneficiary was deemed unsuitable by community standards. They weren't just trying to keep money that wasn't theirs, Victoria said, her voice tight with controlled anger. They were actively working to ensure you would never be able to claim your legitimate inheritance by making you appear unfit to receive it. The pattern extended to their social media activity, where both parents had joined multiple Facebook groups focused on child safety, parental rights, and community protection. They had spent months establishing themselves as concerned parents and grandparents who prioritized child welfare above family loyalty. These groups had provided both the audience and the amplification for their eventual accusations against me. Eugene discovered that they had even contacted several of my former corporate colleagues, spreading rumors about my concerning career change and my obsession with working with damaged children. They had suggested that my transition from marketing to puppet therapy represented some kind of psychological instability that might pose risks to the children I worked with. The corporate contacts had largely dismissed these concerns, but the pattern showed systematic character assassination across multiple communities and social circles. My parents had been working to isolate me professionally and socially, while positioning themselves as responsible family members who had tried unsuccessfully to address my problematic behavior through private intervention. Victoria compiled all of this evidence into a comprehensive report that read like a criminal investigation file. Financial fraud, character defamation, interference with business relationships, conspiracy to deprive someone of legal benefits, and what she termed systematic exploitation of community child safety concerns for personal financial gain. Most fraud cases involve people taking money they're not entitled to, Victoria explained. Your parents went much further. They actively worked to prevent you from discovering your rightful inheritance while using stolen foundation funds to finance a campaign designed to destroy your ability to ever claim what was legally yours. The legal implications were severe, but Victoria warned me that the personal costs of pursuing justice would be equally significant. Exposing my parents would require detailed testimony about their character, their motivations, and their systematic deception. The case would likely attract media attention, given the unusual circumstances and the amount of money involved. They've painted themselves as protective parents, trying to save children from a dangerous individual, Victoria said, proving that they're actually fraudulent opportunists who exploited community fears for financial gain will require us to demonstrate not just what they did, but why they did it, and how calculating their approach was. Eugene had been quietly working on a different aspect of our evidence collection. His connections within the therapeutic community had yielded testimonials from professionals who had observed my work or reviewed my techniques. Dr. Sarah Martinez from the University of Vermont's Child Development Program had written a detailed assessment of my puppet therapy protocols that described them as innovative and highly effective approaches that represent significant advances in trauma-informed care for children. The Children's Hospital of Vermont had documented remarkable improvements in several patients who had participated in my workshops as adjunct therapy to their regular treatment programs. Dr. Michael Chen, the hospital's chief of pediatric psychology, had written that my specialized puppet therapy techniques produced faster and more durable therapeutic outcomes than traditional play therapy approaches. 3 different parents had provided sworn affidavits describing their children's progress during puppet therapy sessions, detailing specific breakthroughs and improvements that they attributed directly to my work. These testimonials contradicted every accusation my parents had made about my character and competence. Eugene had also compiled documentation from other foundation beneficiaries, whose work paralleled mine in different therapeutic specialties. Art therapists, music therapists, and occupational therapists who had received similar support described the transformative impact of proper funding on their ability to serve vulnerable populations. The foundation has supported hundreds of therapeutic professionals over the decades, Eugene explained, showing me letters from colleagues I had never met, but whose work reflected similar dedication to helping children overcome challenges through creative and innovative approaches. Your parents' actions represent an attack not just on you personally, but on the entire model of supporting community-based therapeutic innovation. Victoria had been building towards something she called the evidentiary presentation, a comprehensive demonstration of everything we had uncovered arranged in a sequence that would tell the complete story of my parents, deception and its consequences. Financial documents, communication records, digital evidence, professional testimonials, and documentation of harm to both my business and the children who had lost access to needed services. The presentation filled 3 large binders and included audio recordings of phone conversations, video testimonials from parents and therapeutic professionals, and a detailed timeline that showed the relationship between foundation payments, my parents, financial decisions, and their escalating attacks on my character and business. "We have enough evidence to pursue criminal fraud charges," Victoria said, reviewing the completed compilation. "But more importantly, we have enough evidence to demonstrate publicly why this work matters, and what happens when people try to exploit systems designed to help vulnerable children." Eugene had arranged for representatives from several therapeutic organizations to review our evidence and provide additional context about the broader implications of my parents' actions. The Vermont Association of Child Therapists had written a statement describing how false accusations against legitimate therapeutic professionals undermined community trust in evidence-based treatments for childhood trauma and developmental challenges. The National Foundation for Therapeutic Innovation had provided documentation of similar cases, where community members had exploited public fears about child safety to attack programs that actually provided valuable services to vulnerable populations. They described my situation as a textbook example of how well-intentioned protective instincts could be manipulated by people with ulterior motives. As our evidence compilation neared completion, Victoria began preparing what she called Phase 2 of our strategy. We had documented what my parents had done and proven why their actions were both illegal and harmful. The next step would be presenting this evidence in a way that would achieve maximum impact while ensuring appropriate consequences for their behavior. Your parents have spent months positioning themselves as protectors of children while actually harming those same children by preventing them from receiving better therapeutic services, Victoria said. The community needs to understand not just that they were wrong about you, but that they were actively working against the interests they claimed to champion. Eugene agreed that simple legal vindication wouldn't address the broader damage that had been done. The foundation exists to support innovative therapeutic work and protect it from exactly this kind of exploitation, he said. Your case has created an opportunity to demonstrate why these protections matter and what happens when people try to circumvent them for personal gain. The evidence we had compiled told a story that went far beyond personal betrayal or family dysfunction. It revealed how people could exploit community concerns about child safety to attack legitimate therapeutic work, while profiting from funds meant to support that same work. The irony was profound, but the implications were serious for anyone working to help vulnerable children through non-traditional therapeutic approaches. Victoria closed the final binder and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. "Are you prepared for what comes next?" "Once we file these documents, everything becomes public. Your parents, actions, your inheritance, the foundation's work, all of it will be subject to scrutiny from people who have spent weeks believing the worst possible things about your character and motivations." I looked around Eugene's dining room, at the evidence of systematic deception spread across every surface. At proof that the work I had poured my heart into was not only legitimate but valuable enough to attract substantial financial support from people who understood its true worth. My parents had tried to destroy something beautiful and important, but in doing so, they had forced me to discover just how much power I actually possessed to protect and expand that work. They made their choice when they decided to attack vulnerable children's access to therapeutic services for their own financial benefit, I said, surprised by the strength in my own voice. Now they get to face the consequences of that choice. Victoria had scheduled what she called the intervention for Thursday afternoon at 2 o'clock, timing it to occur when my father would be home from his part-time consulting work, and my mother would have finished her weekly lunch with the neighborhood book club. The precision wasn't accidental. Victoria believed in controlling every variable when confronting people who had demonstrated sophisticated deception capabilities. I sat in the passenger seat of her silver sedan as we pulled into the driveway of the house where I had grown up, my stomach churning with a mixture of dread and determination. The colonial-style home looked exactly as I remembered, with its freshly painted shutters and manicured lawn, but knowing that foundation money had paid for the recent exterior improvements made everything feel contaminated by deception. Eugene rode in the back seat, carrying a leather satchel filled with documents we had assembled over the past week. His presence provided comfort, but also weight to the confrontation ahead. This wasn't just a family dispute. It was a formal challenge backed by legal authority and financial resources that my parents couldn't have imagined. Victoria parked directly behind my father's car, blocking his ability to leave quickly if the conversation became uncomfortable. She had explained that people facing serious accusations often attempted to end confrontations by claiming urgent appointments or family emergencies. The blocked driveway would force them to engage with the evidence we had brought. My mother opened the front door before we could ring the bell, her expression shifting from surprised pleasure at seeing me to obvious anxiety when she recognized the formal nature of our visit. Victoria's business attire and Eugene's unfamiliar presence clearly signaled that this wasn't a social call or family reconciliation attempt. "Lily, sweetheart, what a nice surprise," my mother said, her voice carrying the brittle cheerfulness she used when neighbors visited unexpectedly. "Though you should have called ahead. Your father and I were just about to run some errands." Victoria stepped forward with professional directness. "Mrs. Hartford, I'm Victoria Kane, attorney for the Whitman Educational Foundation. We need to discuss some important matters regarding foundation disbursements and your daughter's business operations. This shouldn't take more than an hour if everyone cooperates fully." The color drained from my mother's face as she processed Victoria's introduction. Her eyes darted toward the street, checking whether neighbors might be observing this official-looking visit, then back to our small group with growing alarm. "I think there's been some misunderstanding," my mother said, stepping back to allow us inside but clearly hoping we would decline the invitation. "We don't have any connection to educational foundations or business matters," Eugene spoke quietly but firmly. "Patricia, we have 18 months of bank records showing foundation payments deposited into your personal accounts. We also have documentation of your recent communications regarding your daughter's professional activities. I think you'll find the conversation more productive if we discuss these matters privately rather than having neighbors over here." My father appeared in the hallway, drawn by voices he didn't recognize. His expression moved through the same sequence as my mother's, from welcome to confusion to dawning realization that something serious was happening. When Victoria introduced herself again, he straightened his shoulders in what I recognized as his defensive posture from childhood disciplinary conversations. "Robert Hartford," he said, extending his hand with forced confidence. "I'm not sure what this is about, but we're always happy to help with any administrative confusion that might have occurred." Victoria declined the handshake and opened her briefcase instead. "Mr. Hartford, we're here because your daughter has recently learned about substantial financial irregularities involving funds intended to support her therapeutic work with children. We have reason to believe you and your wife have information relevant to resolving these irregularities. We moved into the living room that had hosted countless family gatherings over the years. The furniture was the same, but I noticed details that had escaped my attention during previous visits. The new sound system my father had claimed was a retirement gift to himself. The expensive artwork my mother had said came from an estate sale. The renovated kitchen visible through the doorway, which they had attributed to careful saving and my father's recent consulting success. Victoria arranged documents on the coffee table with methodical precision, creating neat stacks that represented different aspects of our evidence. Financial records in one pile, communication logs in another, professional assessments of my work in a third. The visual impact was immediate and overwhelming, transforming casual conversation into formal investigation. Let's start with the simplest issue, Victoria said, opening the top folder. For the past 18 months, quarterly payments totaling $47,000 have been deposited into your joint checking account. These payments were intended to support your daughter's puppet therapy workshop, but were misdirected due to outdated address information. My mother's hands fidgeted with the fabric of her sweater as she stared at the bank statements Victoria had spread across the table. The dates, amounts, and account numbers were clearly visible, creating an undeniable record of money that had flowed into their personal finances while I struggled to fund basic workshop supplies. We did receive some checks, my father admitted carefully, but we assumed they were related to Lily's corporate work or perhaps some kind of insurance settlement. The paperwork wasn't entirely clear, and we planned to ask her about them when we saw her next. Victoria pulled out copies of the checks themselves, showing clear notation that they were for Little Dreams Workshop Therapeutic Programming, and included my business tax identification number. The intended purpose couldn't have been more obvious to anyone who had bothered to read the documentation. Mr. Hartford, these checks were made out specifically to support therapeutic services for children with special needs. The attached documentation explained exactly how the funds were intended to be used. Yet instead of forwarding them to your daughter or notifying the foundation about the addressing error, you deposited them into your personal account and used them for home improvements and luxury purchases. Eugene leaned forward in his chair, his voice carrying decades of authority in business and charitable work. Robert, I personally approved every one of those payments based on detailed reports about Lily's innovative work with children. The foundation doesn't distribute funds carelessly. We had thoroughly documented her therapeutic successes and determined that she deserved substantial support for expanding her programs. My father's defensive posture began to crumble as he realized the people confronting him weren't confused administrators who could be dismissed with explanations about paperwork errors. These were the actual decision-makers behind the payments, armed with detailed knowledge of both the money's intended purpose and how it had actually been used. Moreover, Victoria continued, pulling out phone records and communication logs, we have evidence that you actively worked to ensure these payments would continue coming to you, rather than being redirected to their intended recipient. 6 months after receiving the first check, you contacted our administrative office claiming to be Lily's business manager and requesting that all future payments be sent directly to you. The phone records showed the exact date and duration of my father's call to the foundation office. Victoria had obtained recordings of the conversation, which revealed him using persuasive language to convince the administrator that centralizing payments through him would be more efficient for everyone involved. My mother's face had gone completely pale as she listened to Victoria describe the systematic nature of their deception. This wasn't passive receipt of misdirected funds. It was active fraud that had deprived me of resources while providing them with money they had no legal right to claim. But the more serious issue, Victoria said, her tone sharpening, is what happened when you learned that Lily was about to discover these irregularities and claim her rightful inheritance from the Whitman Foundation. She opened another folder containing social media screenshots, community forum posts, and communication records that documented the character assassination campaign my parents had launched. The timeline was devastating, showing how accusations against my character had accelerated immediately after they received the beneficiary paperwork from Victoria's process server. 3 days after learning that your daughter was inheriting control of a multi-million-dollar educational foundation, you began publicly questioning her fitness to work with children. You contacted parents in her programs, planted suspicions about her methods and motivations, and eventually organized a social media campaign that destroyed her business reputation and drove away her clients. Eugene added documentation that showed the broader scope of their sabotage efforts. You didn't just attack Lily personally. You systematically undermined therapeutic programs that were helping vulnerable children make meaningful progress. Marcus Williams was achieving breakthrough communication skills through puppet therapy. Sophie Chen was overcoming anxiety that had prevented her from speaking in school. Tommy Rodriguez was processing deployment trauma related to his father's military service. The professional assessments Eugene had compiled painted a clear picture of children whose therapeutic progress had been interrupted when their parents withdrew them from my programs based on fears my parents had deliberately cultivated. Dr. Martinez from the University of Vermont had documented how these interruptions in treatment could cause regression and delay recovery for children dealing with trauma and developmental challenges. Victoria showed them letters from parents who had initially supported my work but had been convinced to question my motives and methods. Janet Morrison had written that she now wondered whether Sophie's improvements had been genuine or somehow manipulated. Derek Chambers had suggested that puppet therapy was inherently suspicious because it involved one-on-one interactions between adults and children. You exploited legitimate parental concerns about child safety to destroy therapeutic programs that were actually helping those same children, Victoria said, her voice carrying controlled anger. You used community fears about predators to attack someone whose work was producing documented positive outcomes for vulnerable kids. My father attempted to defend their actions. We were concerned about Lily's judgment and whether she was equipped to handle such responsibilities. Working with damaged children requires special training and oversight that she didn't seem to have. Eugene responded with professional credentials and training documentation that contradicted every criticism they had raised. Lily has completed certification programs in trauma-informed care, autism spectrum therapeutic approaches, and specialized play therapy techniques. Her puppet therapy protocols have been reviewed by leading experts in child development, who describe them as innovative and highly effective. He showed them letters from the Children's Hospital of Vermont, the State Department of Mental Health, and national organizations focused on therapeutic innovation. Every professional assessment praised my work and recommended expanded support for the programs my parents had worked to destroy. Victoria pulled out her final piece of evidence, the digital forensics report that revealed the calculating nature of their attacks on my character. Your internet search history shows extensive research into legal challenges against foundation beneficiaries, methods for reporting suspected child abuse, and strategies for organizing community campaigns against therapeutic professionals. The search history was damning, revealing months of planning that preceded their public accusations against me. They had researched how to file complaints with licensing boards, how to contact Child Protective Services, and how to coordinate social media campaigns that would appear grassroots but were actually orchestrated by people with specific goals. You researched whether foundation assets could be redirected to family members if the original beneficiary was deemed unsuitable. You looked into legal precedents for removing people from charitable trusts based on community objections. You even searched for information about inheriting property from relatives who had been declared incompetent or unfit. My mother finally found her voice, but it came out as a whisper. We were just trying to protect everyone involved. Lily seemed so focused on these children, and we worried that she wasn't thinking clearly about appropriate boundaries. Victoria's response was swift and merciless. Mrs. Hartford, you researched child grooming accusations specifically to use against your own daughter. Your browser history includes searches for signs of predatory behavior in childcare workers and how to report suspected abuse without evidence. You weren't protecting anyone, you were looking for weapons to use against Lily when you learned about her inheritance. Eugene stood and walked to the window overlooking their meticulously maintained backyard, landscaping that had been funded with money stolen from programs designed to help vulnerable children. When he turned back to face them, his expression carried disappointment that seemed to fill the room. I've spent 40 years identifying people who genuinely care about helping children overcome challenges and supporting their innovative work. Lily represents exactly the kind of authentic commitment that charitable foundations exist to nurture and protect. You've demonstrated exactly the kind of exploitation and manipulation that we work to prevent. Victoria began packing documents back into organized stacks, signaling that the evidentiary presentation was complete. Mr. and Mrs. Hartford, you have 72 hours to return the $47,000 you fraudulently converted from foundation accounts. You also have 72 hours to publicly retract every false accusation you've made against your daughter's character and professional competence. My father straightened in his chair, attempting to regain some semblance of authority. And if we don't agree to these demands? Victoria's smile was thin and professional. Then we file criminal fraud charges with the state attorney's office, along with civil suits for defamation, interference with business relationships, and conspiracy to deprive someone of legal benefits. We also provide all of this evidence to the media, along with expert testimony about how your actions harmed vulnerable children who needed the therapeutic services you helped destroy. She stood and adjusted her suit jacket with the confidence of someone who had never lost a case involving people who underestimated her capabilities. Additionally, the Whitman Foundation will use your case as a public education example about how community child safety concerns can be manipulated by people with ulterior financial motives. Eugene added quietly, "The foundation has relationships with therapeutic organizations nationwide. Your actions will be documented and shared as a case study in protecting legitimate therapeutic work from exactly this kind of exploitation." My mother was crying now, but they weren't tears of remorse for the damage they had caused. They were tears of frustration and fear about consequences they had never expected to face. Throughout their months of character assassination, they had positioned themselves as concerned family members making painful but necessary choices to protect vulnerable children. The evidence Victoria had presented revealed them as calculating fraudsters who had exploited those same children's needs for personal financial gain. "We'll need written confirmation of the fund transfer and public retractions by Sunday evening," Victoria said, handing my father her business card. "After that point, all legal options remain available to us, and your cooperation will no longer be sufficient to resolve this matter privately." As we prepared to leave, I looked around the living room one final time. The house where I had learned to walk and ride a bicycle, where I had studied for school exams and celebrated birthdays, would forever be associated with the discovery that the people who raised me were willing to destroy my life's work to protect money they had stolen from vulnerable children. My father made one final attempt to salvage his position. "Lily, we're still your parents. We love you, and we were just trying to look out for your best interests." I met his eyes directly, feeling strength I hadn't known I possessed. People who love me don't steal money meant to help the children I work with. They don't organize campaigns to destroy my reputation and drive away kids who need therapeutic services. They don't research legal strategies for preventing me from claiming inheritance I've earned through legitimate work. Victoria opened the front door, but I paused before following her outside. "You positioned yourselves as protectors of children, while actually harming those same children by undermining their access to effective therapeutic support. The foundation exists specifically to prevent what you've done, and now you get to serve as an example of why these protections matter." Eugene was the last to leave, turning back to address my parents with the authority of someone who had spent decades supporting charitable work and protecting it from exploitation. "Patricia, Robert, you've demonstrated that you're exactly the kind of people charitable safeguards are designed to identify and stop. The foundation will use your case to help other communities recognize similar manipulation and protect legitimate therapeutic work from people who would exploit it for personal gain." As we walked toward Victoria's car, I could see neighbors beginning to emerge from their houses, drawn by curiosity about the official-looking visit that had lasted over an hour. By evening, the entire neighborhood would be speculating about what kind of serious business had required an attorney and formal documentation at the Hartford house. Sunday evening arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that makes Vermont famous for its fall foliage. I sat in Eugene's study, watching the grandfather clock tick toward our deadline, while Victoria reviewed documents on her laptop with the focused intensity of someone who had built a career on preparation and precision. My parents had until 8 o'clock to provide written confirmation of fund transfers and public retractions. At 7:47, Victoria's email chimed with an incoming message from an account I recognized as my father's business correspondence address. The subject line read simply "Compliance Documentation." Victoria opened the attachment and reviewed its contents with the careful attention she gave all legal communications. After several minutes, she turned her laptop screen toward me. The message was brief and formal, acknowledging receipt of foundation funds under circumstances that may have involved administrative confusion, and confirming that full repayment had been initiated through wire transfer earlier that afternoon. $47,238, Victoria read aloud. They included interest calculated from the date of first receipt. That suggests they consulted with their own attorney, which means they understand the seriousness of their legal exposure. The second part of their compliance involved public retractions of their accusations against my character and professional competence. Victoria had drafted specific language that my parents were required to post on their social media accounts, acknowledging that their previous statements had been based on incomplete information and personal concerns, rather than evidence of actual wrongdoing. Eugene peered over Victoria's shoulder as she scrolled through the retraction posts that had appeared on both my parents' Facebook accounts within the past hour. The language was precisely what Victoria had demanded, though the tone conveyed reluctant compliance rather than genuine remorse. Patricia Hartford. I want to apologize for recent posts questioning my daughter's professional activities and character. These statements were based on personal family concerns, rather than evidence of actual problems with her work. I have learned that her puppet therapy programs have received positive assessments from child development professionals and have helped children achieve meaningful therapeutic goals. I retract my previous suggestions that her work posed any risk to child safety. My father's post was similar in content, but slightly more detailed, acknowledging that foundation payments had been inadvertently misdirected to him rather than to my workshop programs, and confirming that full repayment had been completed. He also specifically retracted his suggestions that I was unsuitable to work with vulnerable children. Victoria checked the timestamps and visibility settings on both posts. They've made them public and pinned them to the top of their profiles. The retractions will be the first thing anyone sees when they visit their social media accounts. But the real impact became apparent as comments began appearing beneath the retraction posts. Parents who had shared or supported the original accusations were now questioning what had really happened. Some expressed confusion about the sudden reversal, while others seemed to realize they had been manipulated into attacking someone whose work they had initially supported. Janet Morrison, Sophie's mother, had commented within minutes of the retractions appearing. I feel terrible about withdrawing Sophie from puppet therapy based on these concerns. She was making such good progress, and now I'm wondering if we made a mistake trusting rumors instead of our own observations. Derek Chambers, who had initiated much of the social media campaign against me, posted his own retraction acknowledging that he had jumped to conclusions without sufficient evidence and had allowed personal biases to influence my judgment about therapeutic approaches I didn't fully understand. The community response was swift and decisive. Parents began reaching out directly through private messages, expressing regret about their participation in the character assassination campaign and asking whether their children could return to puppet therapy sessions. The Maplewood Community Center director, Sandra Chen, sent an email formally reinstating my contract and apologizing for the, quote, precipitous termination based on unsubstantiated community concerns. But Victoria had prepared for consequences that extended far beyond simple restoration of my local reputation. The Whitman Foundation's response to my parents' fraud would serve as a public education example about protecting therapeutic work from exploitation by people who prioritized personal financial gain over the welfare of vulnerable children. Eugene had arranged for representatives from several national organizations to review our case documentation and provide statements about its broader implications. The National Association of Child Therapists issued a formal comment describing how false accusations against legitimate therapeutic professionals undermined community trust in evidence-based treatments for childhood trauma and developmental challenges. Dr. Martinez from the University of Vermont's Child Development Program had prepared a detailed analysis of how my parents' actions had specifically harmed the children they claimed to be protecting. Marcus Williams, the boy with autism, who had achieved breakthrough communication through puppet therapy, had regressed significantly after his sessions were canceled based on my parents' accusations. Sophie Chen's anxiety had returned to previous levels when her therapeutic support was withdrawn. Tommy Rodriguez's progress in processing deployment trauma had been interrupted at a critical stage of his recovery. Your parents' fraud didn't just involve stealing money, Eugene explained, reviewing Dr. Martinez's assessment. It directly harmed vulnerable children by disrupting their access to therapeutic services that were producing measurable positive outcomes. Victoria had compiled this documentation into a comprehensive case study that would be distributed to charitable foundations, therapeutic organizations, and community groups nationwide. The goal wasn't just to publicize my parents' wrongdoing, but to help other communities recognize similar manipulation tactics and protect legitimate therapeutic work from people who would exploit public fears for personal gain. The media attention began building on Monday morning when the Burlington Free Press published a front-page article about the case under the headline, "Local Parents Defraud Foundation Attack Daughter's Child Therapy Work." The story detailed how my parents had stolen funds meant to support innovative therapeutic programs while simultaneously working to destroy those same programs through character assassination campaigns. The article included interviews with parents whose children had benefited from puppet therapy sessions, professional assessments of my work from university researchers, and detailed analysis of how my parents had exploited community child safety concerns to attack legitimate therapeutic services. The contrast between their public positioning as child protectors and their actual impact on vulnerable children was stark and undeniable. Regional television news picked up the story by Tuesday, with segments featuring video testimonials from children who had participated in puppet therapy sessions. Marcus demonstrated how he used Mr. Giggles to express feelings he couldn't communicate through direct conversation. Sophie showed how Dr. Cuddles helped her practice brave behaviors when she felt anxious. Tommy explained how puppet play helped him understand that his anger about his father's deployment was normal and manageable. The visual impact was powerful and emotionally compelling. These weren't abstract therapeutic concepts being discussed by professionals. They were real children, explaining in their own words how puppet therapy had helped them overcome specific challenges and develop important coping skills. Eugene arranged for me to be interviewed by Vermont Public Radio about the broader implications of the case for supporting innovative therapeutic work in small communities. I found myself discussing not just what had happened with my parents, but why therapeutic innovation mattered and how communities could better support legitimate programs while protecting children from actual risks. The irony is profound, I explained during the radio interview. My parents claimed to be protecting vulnerable children while actually undermining those children's access to therapeutic services that were helping them recover from trauma and developmental challenges. They exploited legitimate parental concerns about child safety to attack work that was producing documented positive outcomes for the very population they claimed to be defending. Victoria had been coordinating with prosecutors in the state attorney's office, who had reviewed our evidence and determined that criminal charges were warranted despite my parents' compliance with our restitution demands. Financial fraud involving charitable funds carried serious penalties, but the systematic character assassination campaign elevated their actions to a level that demanded formal legal consequences. The criminal charges were filed on Wednesday, with my parents facing multiple felony counts including charity fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and criminal interference with business operations. The indictment detailed how they had not only stolen foundation money, but had actively worked to prevent me from discovering the theft by destroying my professional reputation and business relationships. Local news coverage of the criminal charges included footage of my parents leaving the courthouse after their arraignment, looking significantly older and more defeated than they had during our confrontation at their house. The reality of facing serious legal consequences seemed to have finally broken through their belief that they could manipulate their way out of responsibility for their actions. But the transformation that mattered most to me was happening in my workshop garage, which had been bustling with activity since parents began requesting the return of their children to puppet therapy sessions. Marcus was working on advanced communication skills that built on his previous breakthrough progress. Sophie was using puppet play to practice leadership behaviors and help other children overcome their own anxieties. Tommy had become a mentor for newer children, dealing with family deployment stress. The therapeutic outcomes were remarkable. But what struck me most was how the children seemed to understand instinctively that something important had been protected and restored. They played with increased confidence and creativity, as though they sensed that their therapeutic space was now more secure and valued than it had been before the crisis. Eugene had been working with Victoria to establish what they called the, quote, Community Therapeutic Protection Initiative, a program that would help other small communities recognize and support legitimate therapeutic work while protecting it from exploitation by people with ulterior motives. My case would serve as the foundational example, but they were already identifying other situations where similar dynamics had occurred. Your parents' actions represent a pattern we've seen in other communities, Eugene explained, showing me documentation of similar cases from across the country. People exploit public fears about child safety to attack programs they don't understand, or that threaten their interests in some way. The key is helping communities develop better ways to evaluate legitimate therapeutic work and distinguish it from actual risks. Victoria had established partnerships with law schools that would study our case as an example of how charitable fraud often involves not just financial theft but systematic attacks on the legitimate work that charitable funds are intended to support. Students would analyze the legal, ethical, and community dynamics that had allowed my parents to operate undetected for so long. The Whitman Foundation was using the resolution of our case to announce significant expansion of their support for community-based therapeutic innovation. Eugene had authorized funding for a new grant program specifically designed to help small therapeutic programs develop stronger community relationships, better documentation of their outcomes, and more effective protection against exploitation or attack. My own situation had evolved from running a small garage workshop to overseeing the expansion of puppet therapy programs throughout Vermont and into neighboring states. The Foundation's resources allowed me to develop training materials for other therapists interested in specialized puppet techniques, create standardized protocols for different types of childhood challenges, and establish quality assurance systems that would ensure consistent positive outcomes. The first regional training workshop was scheduled for the following month, with therapeutic professionals from across New England registering to learn puppet therapy techniques that had been refined through my work with local children and validated through university research partnerships. The approach that had emerged from my garage workshop was now being recognized as a significant innovation in trauma-informed care for children. Dr. Martinez had arranged for my puppet therapy protocols to be presented at the annual conference of the American Association of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, where they would be discussed alongside other breakthrough approaches to helping children overcome developmental challenges and recover from traumatic experiences. 3 children's hospitals had already expressed interest in establishing puppet therapy programs based on my techniques, with plans to integrate them into existing treatment protocols for young patients dealing with medical trauma, chronic illness, and extended hospitalization periods. But perhaps the most meaningful transformation was happening right in Maplewood, where community members were learning to recognize and support legitimate therapeutic work, rather than being manipulated by people who exploited their protective instincts for personal gain. The neighborhood had rallied around my workshop in ways that went beyond simple restoration of business relationships. Parents were volunteering to help with program expansion, local businesses were donating materials and supplies, and the community center was providing additional space for group sessions and family workshops. Eugene observed these developments with satisfaction that seemed to vindicate decades of work supporting therapeutic innovation through the Foundation. "This is exactly what we hoped to achieve," he said, watching children arrive for afternoon puppet therapy sessions while their parents chatted supportively in his front garden. Community recognition that therapeutic work deserves protection and support, not suspicion and attack. My parents had entered guilty pleas to reduced charges in exchange for testimony about how they had researched and implemented their character assassination campaign. Their cooperation with prosecutors was helping to identify warning signs that other communities could watch for when evaluating concerns about therapeutic professionals working with children. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for the following month, but Victoria expected they would receive probation and community service rather than prison time, given their cooperation. and the fact that financial restitution had been completed. The real consequences were social and professional, as their actions had become widely known throughout their community and social circles. My father had resigned from his consulting position after clients expressed concerns about trusting someone who had defrauded a children's charity. My mother had withdrawn from most of her social activities after book club members and neighbors made clear their disapproval of her role in attacking legitimate therapeutic work. The distance between us felt permanent and appropriate. People who could systematically undermine work designed to help vulnerable children while positioning themselves as protectors had revealed something about their character that couldn't be overlooked or forgiven through simple apology. But the space their betrayal had created in my life was being filled by relationships and work that aligned with my actual values and goals. Eugene had become a mentor and surrogate family member whose guidance helped me navigate the responsibilities of inheriting significant resources and institutional authority. Victoria had become not just my attorney, but a trusted advisor who understood both the legal complexities of charitable work and the personal challenges of confronting people who had exploited my trust and dedication for their own gain. The children in my programs had become my chosen community, along with their parents who had learned to recognize and support therapeutic work that produced genuine positive outcomes, rather than being swayed by people who manipulated their fears and concerns. 6 months after the confrontation in my parents' living room, I stood in the renovated workshop space that now occupied an entire building rather than just Eugene's neighbor's garage. The walls were lined with hundreds of specialized puppets, designed for different therapeutic applications, organized by the specific challenges they were created to address. Marcus was leading a group session for newer children with autism spectrum challenges, demonstrating advanced communication techniques he had mastered through puppet therapy. Sophie was working with children whose parents were going through divorce, showing them how puppet play could help express and process difficult emotions. Tommy had become a peer counselor for military families, helping other children understand and cope with deployment cycles. The transformation was complete but ongoing. What had begun as a small garage workshop serving a few local children had evolved into a recognized innovation in therapeutic care that was improving outcomes for vulnerable children throughout the region and beyond. My parents had tried to destroy something beautiful and important to protect money they had stolen from the very children that work was designed to help. Instead, they had forced me to discover the true value and potential of what I had created, backed by resources and institutional support I had never imagined possible. The evening light filtered through the workshop windows as children packed up their puppets and prepared to go home with their parents. The conversations I overheard were about breakthrough moments, developing skills, and growing confidence, rather than fears and suspicions about therapeutic relationships. Eugene appeared in the doorway, leaning on his walking stick, but moving with the energy of someone who had lived to see his life's work vindicated and expanded through someone who truly understood its purpose and potential. "Ready to head home, dear?" he asked, though by now we both knew that home was wherever this work was happening, wherever vulnerable children were finding their voices through creative therapeutic approaches, wherever communities were learning to recognize and protect legitimate efforts to help rather than exploit the people they were designed to serve. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.